Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. And what makes this so, I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I have a special co-host for Mormon Book Reviews, I think for the first time, Rebecca Biblioteca. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's my first time kind of morphing over from Mormon media reviews to Mormon book reviews.
And it's because of a very, very special book with a very, very special guest. And that is The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Who's that written by, Maven?
So it's actually not written by somebody, but it's a lot of stories that are compiled by a member of the church. It's, what is it?
Lundwall?
NB Lundwall. Yeah. It's Nels Benjamin, I think, if I recall correctly, the author's name. So this is a book that was really impactful to me as a teenager. And that's why we're coming on the show to talk about it now. And I asked for Rebecca to be here because I know we're going to be talking about folklore. Yep. And Rebecca is a big fan of that. So I thought she would be a great addition to the show.
So we want to thank you, Rebecca, for coming in to do this. And we're doing this actually in the Mormonish studios. You can see behind here. I want to thank Landon for letting us use his equipment and everything. So thanks. Shout out. We really appreciate you guys over at Mormonish.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Happy to have you here in our studio for once.
So yeah, this is fun. I'm in Utah. I'm having a blast. I tell people I'm in, all these Mormons go to Florida to go to Disney World. I go to Utah because this is my Disney World. And so I'm really having a blast here. But one of the things that we wanted to do was have this conversation because actually Maven and I have been having this conversation for a few months now. She really, really wanted to talk about this particular book. We're also going to broaden it out a little bit and talk about Mormon folklore, but she's going to share with us some slides about this book in particular. So we're really excited about that. But before we go there, I do have a quick question for you. You've been through a lot lately, Maven.
Right.
And perhaps you could just update all your fans.
Sure.
How are you doing?
Thanks. So for those that know me, I'm despite my best attempts to make it appear otherwise. I actually took a screenshot of the background that I usually or used to have behind me when I was on one of the shows that I help out with and help with the production of, and that's Mormonism Live. So I took a picture of that so that I could actually use a green screen and appear like I was sitting in my normal spot. And all of that was because starting from October of last year, I have been working from bed because I've had to have surgery on both my ankles, actually. So one at a time. I did ask my doctor to do both at the same time because I thought it'll be really, really sucky for a while, but I'll only have to go through this once. And he refused. So he said I needed to have at least one working leg at a time while the other one was coming up on the recovery. So anyway, yeah, and that's part of why this episode, which I had hoped to do before that first surgery months and months ago, just had to continually get put off because of that. And also because of the holiday season coming up, it was just kind of rough. So I really appreciate you being so patient with me as I kept pushing this episode further and further back and not giving up on me and I'm excited that we're finally now, 4 months later talking about it. Well, so thank you.
And this is the key thing, folks. And I want to say we're using the Mormonish studios, but guess what? We all are in Mormonish studios. This isn't just
yes,
a Zoom
I am out of bed. This is not a green screen.
She's right there. Like yes. We're right there. This is not photoshopping. Like yes, Steve and I are here. We should touch. Ready?
There we go.
It's real. We're really here.
Yes.
Yeah. So I thought the most important thing is, we want to have fun today, but also we just want to talk about, what's so cool is that, we all, Rebecca and I, nobody knew who we were 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Maven is somebody that's new on the scene. And maybe just talk a little bit about Maven, about how, with your situation, you had some great people that you were able to work with through your ordeal and how understanding they were towards you.
Yes, I've been very lucky in being able to. So I've deconstructed from Mormonism. So that's, I guess, kind of a spoiler if people didn't know already. I think the hair maybe gives me away a little bit, just a little bit. But anyway, it was rough for me. My whole life I've been trying to figure out what I want to do. And so when I did land into podcasting, working with podcasts for people deconstructing like me has been really, really great. And so the first podcast I got started working with was Mormonism Live. That's with Bill Reel and RFM. So that was the first team I joined, and that's every Wednesday night. And then from there, I got connected with John DeLynn and Mormon Stories. So I actually I did a Mormon story. It's on there. It's in 2 episodes. I'm not quite like Steve to be able to get 4, but 5. Okay, my bad. But yeah, and so especially with the surgeries coming up, I wasn't able to do my regular day job, and so I'm really grateful that Mormon Stories was able to take me on at that time. And I've been able to do everything from the computer and work from home, which is something I wouldn't have been able to do before. And I do not know what I would be doing if I wasn't able to be working from bed, which is like until today, that's what I have been doing. So yeah, I feel really great. I feel like I have 3 really great and supportive men in my life. And I know that I'm behind the scenes, and that has bothered some people. I know when I first started with Mormonism Live, I think people were maybe hoping that I would be, an on-the-screen co-host. And I do pop up here and there, depending on the topic. Well, I kind of pop in from the side when I have comments. And Bill and Arv have been super, super great at encouraging me to do that, and telling me it's okay to do that. And so it's not me just interrupting their show without their permission. But also I do occasionally co-host when asked, usually by RFM when Bill's out of town. He's a family guy, and he does these things called family vacations, I guess, where he spends quality time with family. Anyway, I don't know what that's like, but anyway, yeah. So I guess where I was going with that is those 2 have just been really helpful, and but I really like doing stuff behind the scenes. So I know there were a few accusations in the beginning, maybe, that it seems kind of like Relief Society, or like the men are getting the attention and the woman's doing the work behind the scenes. But and this is in the podcast world, like the hosts are the hosts. This is Bill and RFM's show. It was their show more than a year before I joined on, so it's never been my show to just show up and be a co-host on. And I actually really like the work I do behind the scenes. I chat a lot with the audience, and I get a lot of interaction and fun from there. So that's why I think, and if people wonder the same thing about Mormon Stories, it's the same thing there. I do a lot behind the scenes, and that's where I'm comfortable, and that's where the majority of my employment comes. So,
and that's the thing too, Rebecca, you've had, of course, you've been my co-host for a while. You made it on the scene, but also you've had the opportunity to work with the Mormon Stories book club.
That is absolutely true. And I agree with you on that, Maven, that it's wonderful to have somebody who's supportive and helps give you a platform for something that you're passionate about and want to do. So yeah, we've had a lot of success with the Mormon Stories Book Club. And like you also said, just a lot of interesting people that you meet, and the behind the scenes is it's fun to get involved in that way, because you really get to meet people and interact with people on a very personal level. But yeah, I'm just new to helping out in the Mormon Stories arena, but I've had a really good experience. And we did an episode with Noah Rashada just a month ago, and I got to be on with John and Margie, and that was I had not really met Margie before. She is just wonderful and lovely, and I just had they were so welcoming. It was just a wonderful experience, so I'm really enjoying it.
Margie's a great co-host, and I know I'm not the only one to say this, but she asks really amazing questions, really gets to the heart of the matter, and a lot of people like her. Yeah.
Wow.
And I actually have something, if I could jump in. Sure. I want to talk about Steve a little bit, if that's all right.
Okay.
Okay. Here we go. So yeah, so I was not working for Mormon Stories yet. There you go. Get the barrier, the safety barrier. No, so I had seen Steve's episodes, and I was curious about them, because it's billed as an evangelical, and I think and Steve knows this. I know John's talked with him about it before. For a lot of Mormons, it's the evangelical crowd is a really rough one. I guess as far as interactions go. So I did serve a mission for the church when I was 21. It was stateside. I served in the Philadelphia area. And so, yeah, I coming, especially from the mission, I would have to say, hands down, the crowd that treated me the worst, the most consistently, was the evangelical crowd. And I had times where I thought, what, if this would never ever happen in a million years, but if I ever did leave Mormonism, I was like, I think I would just be kind of a generic believer in Jesus. I would never want to be an evangelical, never. And even now, there's still a lot of, I guess, kind of resentment. So now I kind of feel there's Mormon phrases, and there's also evangelical phrases that kind of trigger me in the same way. And so, so it was really interesting for me to watch your episode, Steve, and to learn more about you and to learn more about your show. And it was actually, I think, in the chat on Mormonism Live, that was the first time you actually reached out to me and said you would like me to be on your show. And I knew who you were, having seen your episodes. But I remember honestly thinking like, okay, but I mean, and you really love the restoration, which is a bit of a point of pain for me. So I was like, I don't know what I would talk to Steve about. I'm flattered that he asked me, but I was just like, I don't, like, what would we even do? Why does he want me on his show? Like, especially if there's not a topic already. So anyway, so I just politely was like, okay, yeah, I asked you if you had a topic in mind and you didn't. So I was like, all right, I'll if I think of something, I'll let you know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's honestly how I felt at first. I didn't really know what to think of you. And I do want to say, and you've continued to do follow-up episodes where you've interviewed John and he's interviewed you. And it's been really good for me because I think you occupy a space that's difficult for me, but because of how open you are and how kind you are, yeah, you've really done a lot, I think, for me in being able to, I guess, work through things and maybe give a lot of things more of a chance than I would otherwise. And that goes for evangelicals like yourself, but also for Mormons, because you have such a love for Mormon stuff that I'm kind of like, I think you are a balancing force, and I still have resentment. So sometimes I don't want you to do that for me because I want to be resentful. But other times I think when I'm in the right space, you are a bridge builder for me as well. So I just wanted to thank you for that. That was quite the long rant, but that stuff that you've maybe never known. I'm guessing my side of things.
I really hadn't heard any of that, so I want to thank you so much for sharing that today.
And I wanted to say too, I do think, and I'm kind of maybe doing some spoilers for something that's coming out, but actually maybe it'll be out by the time this comes out, so maybe it'll be okay. But you brought up a lot just about how a lot of people are working towards building bridges a lot more than in the past. And as you were talking about it, I feel that that's true. There's still a lot of antagonism still between the two, I guess, factions of religion and atheists, which is also what I am now. Spoiler alert. But I do think there is a growing movement to communicate. And you're a big part of that. And I just think that that's really awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow. Boy.
I would also like to talk about Steve. No, but I'm not kidding. Exactly what you said is correct, Maven, because I mean, I am the co-host of Mormon Media Reviews. I am a post-Mormon, and yet we are able to talk to all kinds of people. And lots of times I'm hesitant. I'll say, Steve, I found this guest, but I don't know. What would we talk about? He's like, well, everything. It's going to be just fine, So I am skeptical, much like you, Maven, but Steve is always able to make it fine. And the conversations are just wonderful, like goosebump-inducing conversations with faithful, nuanced posts, and he can talk to anyone. So it is a very unique platform that you've given to everybody. And it's a bridge-building platform. So I agree.
Well, first of all, thank you. I just make sure we're going to be talking about this book, right? Because
did you guys
hijack my show? Is this praise to the man?
No, it's all related. It's all related because I think this book can also be, and our discussion about it, I think can be friendly to people all along the spectrum of Mormonism, in or out, and also as far as other faiths go. So I think evangelicals, I think anyone would find this, I hope, find this topic at least interesting. So, and what we're really going into with this book is basically the idea of folklore and kind of tribal narratives and the effects that they have. So I think with that we can maybe start to jump in.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is Maven is put together a slideshow in which she's going to discuss this book. And before we do that, well, actually, you're going to kind of give an overview of the book at the beginning. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to introduce the book, what it's all about. And it's interesting because Maven and I have had conversations about, folklore, and of course, even folklore within my Christian community, which is very prevalent. And it's of course prevalent in all communities. But of course, each religious group makes their own unique take on it. Of course, like 3 Nephites, that's not something that's in my world, but it's just kind of fascinating stuff. So so basically you put together this little presentation and you wanted to share it with my audience, and I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. And then we're going to kind of riff on some of the stuff you're talking about, maybe ask you a question here and there. And the most important thing, we're going to have fun today, folks. Let's have fun. So
I hope so.
let me, oh, I got to make sure that the screen share is enabled. So let's do that. Oops, I don't want that. Yep, we're going to fix that for you. We're going to get this all set up, folks. So, all right, Maven, let's tell the story
Okay.
of the fate of the persecutors of the
All
prophet
right. I
Joseph
just need
Smith.
to find my slides now. They
That's
were
right.
up, and
That's right.
of course, right? Here we go.
right.
I've got it. Put it on. All righty. Apologies.
Not a
There
problem.
it is.
There we go. We got it all set up.
Okay.
You're still not seeing it, just so you know.
I'm clicking
There we go.
share right
And
now.
we
Okay,
did it.
perfect.
Mission
So
accomplished.
yes,
Here we go.
so put it on
Here we go.
slideshow. Okay. So yeah, divine retribution folklore. That's basically the topic for today. So I wanted to go. So just a real quick overview. Like we said earlier, this was compiled by a man, and just to give him, I guess, as much credit as I can. He did really try hard to verify these stories that we're going to go over. He had people who were telling him the story, write down affidavits. Some of them were even notarized. They were backed up with second witnesses where they could, but there's still a few problems with the stories that are in here, and we'll go towards, we'll talk about that more at the end. So, and in my copy, I don't know if you can see, most of the tabs I have, and the majority of our discussion about the book is going to be the very last chapter. So we're going to ignore kind of the first 90% of the book, which is a lot of compilations of basically themes of the restoration. It's testimonies of Joseph Smith. It's testimonies about early miracles, early church events. And it's just, I feel like the really good juicy stuff is the last chapter, and that's the chapter where it actually gets to the fate of the persecutors of Joseph Smith. And so so that's where we are starting today. And I think, oh yeah, I just wanted to go here real quick. So this has been in print, I think, continuously since 1952, I believe, is when this first went to print. So if you can see this slide, it's the second one is actually the one that Steve held up, but the cover is gone from it. And then Rebecca's copy is the one on the far right, I think. Yeah. So yeah, and then this has been a very popular book, especially from what I've been told in the 70s and 80s. These kinds of stories were continuously told. So when I first came across this book because my dad had it in his library, and I was a teenager, and I was a very big Joseph Smith fangirl at the time. And so I remember reading this, especially those last parts, and the stories that are told are really, really gruesome. So I will be giving a content warning about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in it. But at the time, it served to really, really solidify my testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet, because again, as a teenager, I just took all of these stories at face value, and I just believed them to be true because I had no other reason not to. And that can have some problems. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. I did want to say these are just some things to kind of maybe keep in mind as we go through. This compiler, he was born in 1884. So Joseph Smith was killed in 1844. I'm remembering that correctly. Nothing like being in camera to make you like question everything that you know. So 1884, this was published in 1952. So he was 68 years old at the time. And that's something I think I just want to maybe kind of keep in mind as we go through it. So so we're going to learn about folklore. We're going to learn about patterns that can kind of help us to see and recognize something as folklore, because I guess just so that things like what happened to me as a teenager, where I just bought everything, or you want to be able to learn if a story isn't true, to be able to suss that out. So hopefully we give you some tools to do that by the end.
Cool.
Do you guys have anything you want to add in
good.
there? Okay.
That's great.
All right, so I want to go into, so this is, just, again, this was showing up before here, but we're talking about curses, diseases, body horror kind of stuff. We're talking about bugs and maggots. So if this is not your thing, this is your warning. But I do want to say I do not have any pictures of anything like that on this slideshow. I'm one of the kinds of people that cannot really handle that kind of picture or that kind of artwork. I did initially try to find some, and I couldn't do it. So I can say we're not showing pictures. It'll all just be discussed. So if that helps out. So I
So
want to
use your imagination.
yeah,
Is that what you're telling us?
yeah,
Just
yeah. I'm
use
okay
your
with the
imagination on all of this.
I
Great.
don't want to see a picture concrete right in front of me, and I assume a lot of the audience probably appreciates that. So, so this right here is just a picture. This is by CCA Christensen, a convert, early convert to the church, and he did a panorama of like 23 different pictures to try to. I guess there was I think this is just an age-old issue. The younger generation seem not to be as strong as the older ones. So we're in about third generation Mormonism at this time. And so he created this painting to help remind the younger generation of where they came from. So that is one of the purposes of folklore. There is always a purpose. There is always, I guess, a motive, an ulterior motive to a story being told. And so usually a really big one is kind of this in-group feeling, tribal cohesion. And so that's why I selected this picture to kind of go over that. And then I know, did you guys want to jump in on that at all, or
No,
we can keep going? Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very old mosaic. This is Lot's wife turning to salt, looking back on Sodom and Gomorrah. So another purpose of folklore is to teach a lesson or sometimes explain the way things are. So I've heard kind of more than one thing for this one, that there are in this place of the world, there are unique rock formations that are potentially a source of this story. But also, there's kind of a moral about looking back on something bad when when God has told you to move forward and he's giving you everything that you'll need. Looking back on the world and maybe what riches or things that she might be missing. So there's kind of a moral here where she's punished, basically divine punishment for not, I guess, for not being satisfied with what God is about to give her. These are American. Well, they're not American. I guess they come from Europe. So we've got Little Red Riding Hood, and this is Hansel and Gretel. Again, and I won't go too deep into this, but a lot of the morals are sexual ones, and so I'll leave that for the audience to delve into another day. But the Little Red Riding Hood is a metaphor.
Well, and not only that, but many of these stories have been greatly sanitized.
Yeah.
Right?
Over
Yeah,
a period
some
of time.
were much more different than when they were originally written. So this is another one back to CCA Christensen. This is I'm forgetting like the exact battle, but this is I think a Missouri mob or a Missouri militia getting divine retribution. You can see this is a really chaotic scene. The river the water's choppy. You've got the zigzags in the sky of kind of like lightning, and they look anguished. But the real story is that this was actually very likely a very calm river. On a clear night with plenty of moonlight, kind of a thing. So there's always I think the reason why I put this here is the idea in the folklore of clear villains and clear heroes, which I think hopefully we know by now. When it comes to human nature, we've got a little bit of both in each of us, and a lot of it kind of depends on which group you're in, who are the heroes and who are the villains. And then this last one is the scene. This is the murder of Joseph Smith and his brother. So that's Carthage jail in the background there. But you can see he's obviously very clearly using light rays coming in from the top corner. And you can see the body of presumably Joseph Smith there. And he's all dressed in white. He's very bright. And so, yeah, so these are more things to just kind of build that group cohesion and kind of paint out the us versus them.
Right.
So did we want to talk about some other examples like that you guys have thought of?
Well, it's very common within the evangelical world, of course, too, that we have very similar folklore tales. And one of the things, actually, it's interesting because like within like the Christian folklore, I live in a community in which a lot of people are televangelists, and often a lot of your televangelists get their start at our community. And you and I have talked about this, Maven, about the better the origin story that you have,
Right.
that's kind of like how maybe you'll be a successful televangelist. And this is the thing: is in many cases you'll have these people who, before they knew God or before they were saved, something really horrible happened to them, life altering. I remember seeing like some guy coming through and showing him in the hospital bed and all these things that have been helping, and somehow he was saved and redeemed, and now he's a televangelist to spread the good word and all this kind of stuff. So there's this almost like this superhero thing where you got to have an origin story, and it actually it's almost like these televangelists have to create a story to kind of justify where they're at, and then that they have this great message to tell the world. It's kind of just a fascinating thing that I've picked up on, because I used to hang out. I mean, I was offered jobs from televangelists, and I was like, oh, that's the angle he's taken, and so I realized that by creating your own backstory and your own folklore, maybe maybe exaggerating a minor thing that was in your life and making it into this big thing.
In this case, like giving credibility.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's just fascinating to see the development of folklore and stuff like that. But of course, and of course, if you, man, if you maybe, a great story is this kid. He's graduates from high school, and he's expecting a car or some big gift or something like that. And so his father gives him a Bible, and the kid gets all angry because he got this Bible, and I was expecting all this kind of, and he gets all angry and upset, and tosses it away, or doesn't even open it, and realize later in life that it was like $20,000 put in the Bible.
I've heard that one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've heard all those stories. So that's kind of the folklore that we've had, in that if you don't, you're going to suffer the consequences if you don't follow God and stuff like that, or if you reject the Bible, literally toss the Bible, and of course then he tossed his future in one sense. So yeah, that's just kind of interesting stuff. And of course, we could talk later on about how folklore can kind of become something very, very sinister as well. But I think we could maybe save that for later in the conversation, and we can continue. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Did you want to riff on that too?
Yeah, I wanted to riff on that real quick. Was just the idea. I think because the gospel of Jesus Christ is a gospel of redemption, and that is what makes it necessary for you to have a really significant redeeming arc in your life story. Otherwise, if you're a rich trust fund kid who's lived a life of privilege, and you was able to go to Harvard, no problem, and top of the class valedictorian, and just like everything in life is going for you, it just doesn't really lend well to teaching this redeeming arc, especially if there's not been any struggles, with drugs or homelessness. I feel like that's a common motif I see in these kinds of stories. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of point that out, that I think maybe Christianity is kind of unique in that way, where you're not credible if you haven't, been a hooker or promiscuous or a drug addict or living in your car, something like that. Like those things that are usually really bad looking are actually a positive in this space. So it's just kind of an interesting flip on what's normal, I think. Yeah.
That's true. What about you, Rebecca?
Well, I think it's because there's no room for a gray area. I think perhaps, especially in the Mormon world, you're either bad or you're good, right? And I saw an example of this. And it makes it easier for people to sort things out, right? Don't you think? So I saw an example of this in a play that I attended that was about the martyrdom in the early days of Joseph Smith. It was called 1820. And it was very obvious who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, right? The bad guys, well, they had cigars and they were using rough language and their clothes were all dirty and torn, right? I mean, you instantly knew, oh, this is the mob. These are the evil people, right? But then, of course, the other characters, they were fine, upstanding. So even appearance, demeanor, they needed the audience to know right away. And you didn't even have a motivation or a reason why they were acting the way they were. They just simply were the mob, and they just simply were evil. And I think as we get more into this book, we'll understand the mob is not what you think the mob is. I mean, this is a conversation I've had with my Mormonish co-host a lot. The mob is not who you think, but it's all your perspective. Like I come from intense polygamous ancestors, highly celebrated in my family. And my dad, who's a wonderful person, tells this story, humorous story about when the polygamy raiders came after our family. And I said, "You mean law enforcement?" No, no, polygamy raiders. I said, "You mean the law of the land?" No, they were in his mind, it wasn't just the sheriff. It wasn't the person with the power to enact the law. These were evil polygamy raiders. And that was what was in his mind. And you couldn't tell him differently. So
Yeah,
it's perspective right there.
there you go. Let's go ahead and jump into, oh no, there were just a couple things actually I did want to go into, and you kind of brought some of them in. So besides the clear heroes and villains,
Yes.
there's a lot of symbolism, and a lot of that is used to designate virtue or vice. We'll talk about those. And then just patterns in general. A lot of times folklore will have similar arcs, just like we talked about the pattern, Steve, with televangelists. There's the down in the dumps moment, and then this calling, and then now here they are. So there's things like that, or even just sometimes small patterns like sets of three, when someone has to go back and forth to some more than one time. It's usually going to be in a set of three, or occasionally four, because there's four hemispheres of the earth, there's four directions of the winds. So sometimes you'll get four in there. And a lot of times patterns and symbolism kind of I guess overlap each other. So we'll go over that. So yeah, so going over those things just really briefly, I'm hoping the audience will be on the lookout. We're going to go ahead and jump into a few of these stories. So and I did put these also on the slides. I'm going to share my screen again. Just so people can read along, because I feel like sometimes it's difficult to just hear somebody reading, and I don't think I have the best like sharing or reading voice. So we'll see. So this is the first person, and as you can see, it's just Old Man Brooks. A first name is never given, so that makes it really difficult to potentially research what supposedly happened to this man, and if it actually did happen or not. And I didn't dig deeply into that, but we can kind of go into why. So these are just some key points of the story here. It's told by a man named William H. I think it's pronounced Chapel. And he was born April 29th, 1874. So this is still like pretty early on. This is quite a bit before 1952, when this gets compiled. So, or technically 1948, as you can see there, at the age of 74, that's when this person is putting this story down. So that's something I just want to keep in mind. The story is said to take place when he is 18 years old. This is 1892. And Brooks, his son, is named Alf, but he's just only referred to as Old Man Brooks. So that's why, and that's what I continue to refer to him like throughout this. So there are many disputed lists of mob members, and none of them, I think there was at least 3 different lists that I looked at. None of them had a surname Brooks. So that's already kind of one clue here. But let's go ahead and go on into the reading. So, and I tried to edit these stories down to be as brief as possible to get the main thing. But this book is available. I know maybe in show notes, it's actually archived. It can be found free online, so you can look into any of these. If you feel like I'm deliberately leaving out things that would substantially change the story, you can absolutely check this out yourself. So here we go. Old Man Brooks. About the year 1892, when I was 18 years of age, an old man by the name of Brooks moved into the neighborhood. The old man used to come to my father's home, sit on the porch, and talk to my father. The conversation turned to pioneer stories and of Joseph Smith, the prophet. On one particular evening, after my father had talked about Joseph Smith, the old man Brooks said, "Mr. Chappell, I saw the last bullet shot into the old boy." And okay, here we go. After Mr. Brooks had gone to his cabin, my father said, "No wonder he is a miserable old soul. If he saw the last bullet shot into Joseph Smith, he was in that mob. If he was in that mob, it has been prophesied that he will suffer all kinds of torment. His limbs shall rot off his body, and he will not have courage to take his own life." After this conversation, I took particular notice of the old man and how he suffered. The old man had a belt which he wore around his waist, which the son would take off, then beat the old man with it just to hear him scream. And when beating him, the son would laugh and profane and seemed to enjoy it. All of this I saw. The old man was crippled and could walk only with the aid of 2 sticks, which I relate to, funnily enough, one in each hand, and without the aid of these, he was totally helpless and unable to walk. The cause of this crippled condition was unknown to me. While living here, his toes rotted off his feet. The son would often leave his father for 3 or 4 days and sometimes a week without any food. I was up to my brother-in-law's ranch one fall in November when an 8-inch snow fell, the weather clearing up in the afternoon and dropping to 0 weather by night. My brother-in-law and I took over an extra quilt and some supper to the old man, and also chopped wood, which we piled close to the stove so that he could handily keep the fire going during the night without getting out of bed. After returning home later in the night, I heard him screaming. I awoke my brother-in-law and he said, "Don't take notice of him. He always screams like that." When we got up the next morning, we looked towards his cabin and saw that the house was gone. We immediately went to where his cabin had been and found it had burned to the ground during the night. Oh, okay. There we go. All of the old man's clothes had burned off of him, and he was burned all over his body from his feet to the top of his head. He was alive and lay curled up in the ashes of the burned cabin, trying to keep warm. We secured some quilts, and with team and sleigh, we took him to Pioa, I don't know, where we found the son. The people of Pioa took up a collection which amounted to $5, gave it to the son, and told him to go to Park City for the particular medicine he was directed to buy. With the money, the son bought liquor and became drunk and did not return for 4 days. The old man died on the 4th day after he was burned before his son returned. His remains were interred in the Pioa cemetery. The son was ordered out of the, I think it's supposed to be county, and he left immediately for parts unknown. So, thoughts?
What a tale.
Yeah.
The,
absolutely.
one thing that I think is so unusual is how many of the members of the mob moved to Utah so that these things
Yeah.
could happen in front of the eyes of the
Conveniently.
saints. Yeah, I mean, it just seems amazing that they had no regard for the saints whatsoever, yet later decided I'd better move there and let my flesh rot off. It seems to be a
Right.
continuing
It would be a shame if they
story.
stayed back
Yeah,
east.
they would
and that
never
was,
know
yeah.
about it. Yeah, they
Well,
have to do
what's
it in front of the
interesting
saints.
is
Yeah.
a lot of these stories are from saints that have gone back east and are able to see it. So you would think that would be enough for everybody.
Yeah,
But that
they
also
have to
that
come
did
here.
strike me as extremely convenient that a lot of these supposed
Yeah.
mobsters ended up in Utah, again,
Well,
where the saints could see their divine demise.
firsthand. And I think maybe that also says, of course, everyone is drawn to Zion, right? Even those in the mob, even if they have to come here and rot, they have to come here. So
Yeah.
it's a very interesting theme.
That's a good point. Steve, did you want to add anything, or we can go on to the
Let's
next
go to the
story?
next one.
Okay.
Let's see.
All right. So I picked 3. So this one, a Jack Reed. This is told in the journals of a Martha J.C. Cox. She was born March 3rd, 1852. Again, so that's a full 100 years before the compilation of this book. The story is said to take place in 1869 in Dixie Valley. That's in southern Utah / kind of the Nevada area. And again, this is another one where I could not find a Jack Reed listed among any of the lists of supposed mob members. So going on from here is the story of Jack Reed. Okay, and Martha was a school marm. This was her role in this area, and she had moved there for this. So at a meeting in St. Thomas, Nevada, called of all the people to consider the wants of the school and the quote unquote Mormon teacher, each citizen was asked to give his mind. One man, a Jack Reed, an old man who was respected in the valley, living then in St. Thomas, said in this meeting that he was a member of the mob who martyred the prophet. He was about 15 years old at the time. He said he took his gun and marched proudly to Carthage and took part in the killing of the 2 prophets. About the last of September, I heard that Jack Reed was very sick of a strange ailment. He was taken ill in a few days after having made the statement that he took part in the affair at Carthage. Again, very convenient. But no one had told me of his sickness until I heard it from one of my Indian friends. So of course, this is Native Americans, who said he had worms in his flesh. I determined to see him if I could and tried to get him to verify the statement he had made at the meeting. I asked Mr. McGuire, that was his, handler, keeper, if he would allow Mrs. Whitmore and myself to visit Mr. Reed. He said that Mr. Reed was a sight that no white woman could be allowed to look upon. He was literally eaten alive by worms. His eyeballs had fallen out, the flesh on his cheeks and neck had fallen off, and though he could breathe, he could take nourishment only through an opening in his throat. And, said McGuire, Pieces of flesh as large as my 2 hands have fallen off from different parts of his body.
I'm
The sick
glad
man-
that you did not have pictures, maybe.
Yeah.
I have to say.
The sick man's farm was given to the white men who attended him in the first of his ailment. And finally, when they could no longer endure the ordeal, the Indians were called in to pour water into his throat and give him whatever other attention they could. And these received the sick man's bunch of horses for their pay. So nothing's, I think, shows a good old-fashioned story, like good old-fashioned racism here, but it's part of the narrative. When he finally passed, the Indians carried out the awful remains by the 4 corners of the blanket upon which he had lain for weeks and lowered that into the box the white men had prepared. The blanket was tucked in over him and the box quickly nailed up and put into the deep grave as soon as possible. No funeral was held. And I think I've got one more. Yeah. I had gathered the idea that this bunch of enemies were heading a petition against me because I was a polygamist. But during Reed's sickness, all talk of Mormons seemed to die down. It was not for a long time, some years afterwards, that I learned the cause of the qualm. One called Jack Longstreet became Reed's first attendant in company with McGuire. To these men, Reed confessed that his participation in the murder of the prophets was the cause of his affliction. He said to Longstreet, "It is the Mormon curse that is upon me. I cannot live. I must utterly rot before I die." He said that Brigham Young had pronounced that curse upon all that mob, and he had known 13 of them to die just as he was dying. So, thoughts on that one?
It's great. I mean, it's just amazing that you're trying to. I mean, these are very dramatic stories. I love it. It is very convenient that the saints are able to witness it in their backyard, which is a fascinating thing.
Right. And he just so happened to fall ill after a few days after confessing, publicly to this Mormon woman, included that he was a member of the mob. But until then, he'd been fine, and he'd known 13 other men to die just the same way. And I don't know if I kept this part in, but the reason why, he thought, yeah, here it is. He had lived so long and he had passed the unlucky number 13, he thought to escape the curse. I think this is the last slide on this one. He charged his attendants to never do anything against the Mormons, to be their friends, or, said he, you may suffer the Mormon curse. Longstreet related this confession of Reed's as a warning and declared that he himself would not dare to raise a hand against them. And I don't think he ever did. Maybe that's why you are at where you are, Steve. Maybe, I don't know. Was there anything like this in your life where someone was like, don't ever be upset at Mormons, you should be their friends?
That's right.
Yeah, I was taught at a very early age about the Mormon curse. I was like, okay.
Everyone knows
That's
about
right.
the Mormon curse.
Everybody knows it.
And then I thought I better come up with a really good origin story. No, I'm just joking.
And you did.
Perfect.
And
Yeah.
you did. That's
Yeah.
right. I find it interesting that most of them are friendless. Family, even if they do have family members, the family members could care less. Like they really are just the untouchables. But then I
Right.
also find it interesting that, and this is true, that most of them were very proud of their involvement.
Yes.
As we'll probably talk about later, it was something that they felt they had done a civic duty for
Right.
humanity, and they had no problem talking about it
Right.
their
And-
eyeballs
until-
popped out
yes,
and their
until
throats
they were hit by the
disintegrated and
Mormon
their
curse.
worms. Yeah. Until then, they were very proud of their involvement.
So I have one more story to go over, and then we'll kind of dive in 2 more. So again, this one is unnamed, but he's a grandpa. So we will. There's a grandson as part of this. So this story is told by Thomas Nichols. It's told to take place in 1870 or 1887 in the Western Sheep Ranges, and this, as best as I can understand, it's near Weber River. So that's in northern Utah. It's north of Salt Lake, and that's all the information. And obviously, I can't look up an unnamed grandpa in the. I'm sure there were a lot of grandpas in the
Yeah, you
in
could
the
get
list.
baptized for them or do
Right.
work for an unnamed grandpa. Yes, you
Yes,
could.
so I don't know which one this is. That would be funny to hear that as a name read out.
I've heard big names before that it could be.
Yeah, sometimes it's been.
Yeah, very
And
big.
again, we're talking about Mormon temple ritual when we do baptisms or other ordinances for those that have died. Sometimes it is done if just like a first name or even a last name is known. So anyway, here we go. So this is from Thomas. Out in the country, one day, a little boy about 9 to 11 years of age came to my camp. He was very dirty and shabbily dressed and was very shy. I noticed he was watching me very closely as I busied myself preparing my dinner. I asked him if he was hungry. He did not answer me, but in a few minutes, he went to the creek and went through the motions of washing his hands. When he came back to the camp, I looked at him and smiled at him. When the dinner was ready, I asked the blessing on it. The lad looked at me in wonder, but as he did not speak a word, I gave him a generous supply of fried potatoes, onions, lamb, and bread. He ate it very quickly, got up and ran down to the creek, and was gone. In a few days, he came again and made for the creek once more. This time, he was not so shy. I asked him where he came from. He just pointed down to the river. I asked his name. He said Jim and was gone again. So Jim's grandpa. That's about as far as we can get as far as the name. He visited me several times. On one of his visits, I asked him if he did not get enough to eat. His reply was, sometimes Grandpa has some, and sometimes he did not. Grandpa snares rabbits and catches fish, but mostly his feet hurt him, and he did not try. I gave him flour and mutton to take home with him. The next day he came again and asked if I had coffee. Grandpa wants some and some tobacco. I explained to him that I did not use either one. I decided I would visit the grandfather. I found him in an abandoned cabin situated in a grove of aspens. He was not very friendly. The little boy told him I was the man that had sent the food to him. Then he came and sat down on a bench outside the cabin. I noticed that he had several bad sores on his face and that his hands were wrapped in rags. I asked him his name, but he did not answer. He finally told me he was from the east and had drifted west. I asked him what was his object in coming to Utah. He said, I don't know. I just drifted here, and this cabin was empty, so I decided to stay a spell. I noticed that the lower part of one ear was gone. A part of the left side of his nose had rotted away, and there were other repulsive sores on his face. He showed me his hands. There was very little solid flesh on them. I expressed my sympathy for him, and he said his feet were worse than his hands. I asked him what had caused all this trouble, and he replied, I don't know, unless it was a curse God had placed on me. He said some men had told him that was it, because he was with the men who killed Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet. I guess that is the main reason I drifted out here. I wanted to know how the Mormons made out without Joe Smith to lead them. And I believe that's the end of this one. So, yes. Anyway, yeah, thoughts on that?
Very interesting because we have had this conversation before off camera about how many of these stories also integrate people who maybe weren't following word of wisdom. They made a point to have tobacco and coffee in this story that's made like, hey, in other cases we have people that maybe were drinking alcohol, so you're also tying that into the story as well. A lesson to be learned that, you should follow the word of wisdom as well.
Right. That's the symbolism and kind of the vice signaling that we see here. Yeah. Any other thoughts about things you guys noticed or?
I think it just makes it very clear there's no question that these people deserve what they are getting, right? And they're breaking the word of wisdom and they're on the edge of society. They've committed this heinous act in their past. There's no question that this is what needs to happen. So.
Right. So I kind of wanted to go through the things that we had talked about in the beginning if we revisit kind of the idea about tribal cohesion and in-grouping versus out-grouping. Like I said, the word of wisdom, that was one of the things to kind of signal an out-grouping. Anything else that you guys saw with that or I guess any thoughts on that part of it?
No, I don't know. What about you, Rebecca?
I just think that they're all portrayed as sort of lost, no focus, no purpose. They're wandering. Yep. The saints know who they are. They know what they're doing. They're there with a purpose. They're industrious. These people are just aimless and lost.
They do not belong to a cohesive community.
They do not belong. Yep,
they're kind of made to wander in the wilderness as a punishment.
Yes.
And so it has a biblical theme to it. You don't touch God's anointed and see what happens when you do.
Yeah, you're gonna get cast out. Absolutely. Cast out.
That's perfect. And wandering is another theme that's pretty common throughout the stories. If like this person, very unlucky, you get both the wandering, the inability to settle down, and the rotting. Some are lucky to just get away with one or the other.
Oh my goodness.
So I did want to talk about kind of explaining and making sense of the world. So this isn't quite the same as a salt pillar, or a story being told to explain maybe why like a mountain range is there, but it does do something for the saints because because their prophet was killed and they were not expecting that. He was still very young. And so it was a shock. And now, I mean, there is a narrative now that many believe to be somewhat dubious, but of Joseph Smith basically saying that he knew he was going to die. The phrase he uses is he's going as a lamb before the slaughter. But even if Joseph did know that, I think it would be safe to say that the saints sure didn't. And Joseph had gotten out of many scrapes up until this point, and especially at this point, I think you could be said that he was at the height of his power. He had a lot of influence and yeah, status where he had a lot of control really over the area. So I do think it was a great surprise for this to happen for the saints. And it wasn't just enough for them that Joseph was killed, because the conflicts that they were still having with their neighbors and in Missouri did not end there with his death, and they were still run out of the state. Eventually, a large contingent of them, what is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, followed Brigham Young out to what was not the US anymore, but out to, I think it's technically Mexico at that point, out in the wilderness. Again, themes are coming across here. But yeah, they followed a prophet to basically seek the ability to be themselves. So what these kind of stories do when you don't get justice right the first time, God was maybe sleeping in that day, or just dropped the ball, or he was helping somebody else find their keys. This is a way to kind of maybe bring balance back to this world, bring some justice back, especially when you feel so strongly as the saints did that justice had not been done. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Oh, I do. Yeah, that's an absolute theme there. And I think there was a sense of helplessness. How did this happen? Like you said. And then, of course, you have this idea that you collectively and personally need to do something to avenge this. I mean, you're told in certain ceremonies that you're responsible for avenging it. How do you do that exactly? Well, okay, you have Mountain Meadows. Why did that happen? I mean, on a very simplistic level, they believed what? The people in the wagon train were part of the mob who had killed another prophet. So you have the sense of these people, I don't know, kind of crippled by inaction. They're not able to do anything. So then you turn to these stories, which are extremely satisfying. You personally can't do anything, even though you're tasked with it in the temple and everywhere else to avenge. You can't do it, but you can certainly be on board, and you can promote and spread these stories that we'll see it did happen. It was divine intervention. We couldn't do it, but it eventually happened.
But God did.
Yeah, so it's a very comforting story to spread and to internalize, I think.
Yeah, when I had come across these stories as a teenager, like I said, I was a big Joseph Smith fangirl at the time. I was reading tons of stuff about him. I thought he was super great, and I was super upset at the fact that he was martyred. I really genuinely, intensely felt sadness for this event in our history. And in reading this book, it actually got me to the point where I actually did, I never thought would happen. I really felt bad for these guys, because I thought, man, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. So I just realized that had they gotten their, I guess, punishment through the law of the land, and maybe having been put into jail, or tried and gone through all of this, that would have been so much better for them. They wouldn't have known it at the time, but way better than when God has to send his retribution down. So I did genuinely feel bad for these men, and I did genuinely fear any chance ever of going against, especially being born into the church. If I ever left the church as someone who knew the truth and were to leave it, I absolutely believe that this kind of fate would be, or could be mine, as it could be for anybody that would leave the church. So these narratives were really, I think, successful in that regard for me. And then you guys brought this part up already, that the moralistic version. It's obviously, this is what happens to you when you go against God and you go against his chosen prophets. And you guys are so great. We got a lot of the heroes and villains. We kind of talked more about the villainy. Let's talk about the heroes, because I mean, in all of these stories, the members of the church are all very kind. And actually, I do have some slides further to go. It's a little bit out of order, but let me go ahead. And let's see. Sorry, I know I'm not sharing. 1 second here.
While you're finding it, I'll say that what you just said made me think of those stories continue, especially when you gravitate away from Mormonism or become a post-Mormon. There's a lot of narratives that say, look Look what happened to her. I'm not surprised,
Right.
be whatever it is, job loss, divorce, health
Yeah.
problems, and there, I
It does
think
still
there's that
happen.
sense of
Yeah.
comfort that look, and I think people who do gravitate away, like you say, it's very ingrained. And I think maybe you do tell yourself for a minute, oh, did this happen to me? Because no, it's just normal. You have to remind yourself sometimes that life happens, good, bad, the ugly, everything, but that's still very deep seated. I think that did you do something that's causing something? I think we're all
Yes.
hardwired to have that at least a little bit inside.
And I think this happens to a lot of people who deconstruct religion. It
Mhm.
definitely happens in
Yeah.
Mormonism, but I've also seen it
Yeah.
in other circles as well. The idea, I think that the tough idea that sometimes your believing friends and believing family are almost hoping for these kinds of things to happen to you. And the idea of it is not because they want you to hurt or be punished, but that they're hoping that in having dark
Mhm.
times, you're brought back to Jesus, just like
Yeah.
your narrative, Steve,
Yeah.
with the televangelists.
Exactly.
That's kind of the hope. Maybe
Yeah.
not that you'll go that far and you'll become that high up and as far as you're following Jesus, but just enough of a bad time to kind of get you back on track. And honestly, I felt this for my own brother, who left the church very early on, very young. I would say he was someone that it just didn't take from the beginning, where I was extremely devoted. It was kind of not a surprise when he left the church. But whenever bad things happened to him, I did harbor this belief that maybe this is what's going to bring him to God, and that's something that I feel some regret over now.
Cool.
So
Cool.
yeah, go ahead, Steve. Did you
Oh
have?
no.
Okay.
So why don't you show us your next thing you wanted to talk about?
All right. So it says screen sharing's paused. Oh, there it
Oh,
is. Resume share. No, it's me. So I just couldn't find the resume. I see the stop,
Here we
but
okay.
go.
okay. I
Yeah,
think
there
you
you go.
guys see
Heroes
it
and
now.
villains.
Yep.
Heroes and villains.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this is going back to the stories, and it's the same screen like slides I've had up before, but I've just highlighted here. For the Old Man Brooks story, my brother-in-law and I took over an extra quilt and some supper to the old man. They also chopped the wood that they piled close to the stove so that he could keep the fire going during the night without getting out of bed. I always thought this part of the story is a little bit interesting, knowing that the house burns down after. It's just never addressed, and I just don't know how I feel about it. But so I'll just say that, I guess. And then again, we secured, after the house burned down, we secured some quilts, and with Team and Slay, we took them to Peoa. They found the sun. They got a collection up together for medicine, all of this stuff. And so this is actually a new one. So this is a secondary affidavit to this story. So I'll go ahead and read this. This says, I, Joseph H. Wild, was present when my brother Thomas Wild and others took the blankets to the cabin to cover the old man, as stated in the above affidavit. The old man was an habitual user of chewing tobacco, and upon this occasion, my brother had purchased a plug for him and presented it to him. Very nice. The old man thought it was a revolver that was being shoved towards him and exclaimed, "For God's sake, don't shoot me." So that was, a secondary story to that one. But again, like, and this is kind of unusual. We have a Latter-day Saint that's kindly purchasing tobacco to present to the man as a gift. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, again, just very, very kind Latter-day Saints here. Although this man was implicated in the murder, so we definitely know what he did, yet the Latter-day Saints who resided in this vicinity were very considerate and brought food and clothing to him. Particularly was this true of my brother Thomas Wild, who resided but a short distance from the cabin in which the old man, Mr. Brooks, lived. So they spell it out very clearly right there. All of us Latter-day Saints were very considerate of this, despite knowing he was the filthy, dirty murderer of our beloved prophet. So
Well,
yeah,
because God was going to take care of him. They
right,
didn't have to dirty their hands. They could
right,
still be charitable and follow the tenets of the religion to help. And
yes,
God was going to do
no
the
compromises
dirty work
here.
of the maggots and the ears dropping off
Yeah,
and all of that
they can
stuff.
do
So yeah, it
the
was
worst
far
of it.
worse, like you said, than
Yes.
a human being could do to someone.
Yeah.
So,
So this one is from the unnamed grandpa. Again, I'm just highlighting the things that I asked him if he was hungry. So he's already offering food to this boy. He smiled at him. He asked the blessing on the food because, of course, he's not going to shirk his duty there and not thank God for the food. And then, of course, the lad looks at him and wonders, just, I think, a clear indication that, like, what is this this guy's doing? Thanking God for this food. And then, yeah, he gives him a generous supply of fried potatoes, onions, lamb, and bread. And then this is, I guess, where the villainy comes in with Jack Reed. And you were saying, Rebecca, they were very proud of it. So he marched proudly to Carthage and took part in the killing of the two prophets. And then then he's warning to not do anything against the Mormons, be their friends, or you will suffer this Mormon curse. Um, and then this is actually a different story that is elsewhere in the book. I often heard of an old mobocrat by the name of Coogan, who lived in that vicinity and who boasted of having helped to murder Joseph and Hiram Smith at Carthage. He often sent a request to me to visit him and proffered to tell me all about the manner of the death of our prophet. So again, we have a boastful braggart. This is another one, Corporal Belton. John Wesley Inman, late of Surrey County, North Carolina, stated that he was well acquainted with Corporal James Belton and that many times he had heard Corporal Belton state that he took part in the killing of Joseph Smith and that he shot at him, taking as good an aim as he ever did at a squirrel. Another one, Robert D. Foster. He says, I'm the most miserable wretch that the sun shines upon. If I could recall 18 months of my life, I would be willing to sacrifice everything I have upon earth, my wife and child not accepted. I have not seen one moment's peace since that time. I know that Mormonism is true, and the thought of meeting Joseph and Hiram at the bar of God is more awful to me than anything else. So this one is not bragging. So that's the other category. We do have braggarts, but we do also have the repentant and those that feel sorry for what they do, but they're still not exempted from the wrath and the punishment that God is going to mete out to them. And this is another wanderer one. It just, there's no name or anything given, just a walking man. And this is what he said: I was in that Smith scrape. Now I can rest nowhere. They prevailed on me to go with them. Would to God I had been 1,000 miles away. So again, we have a regretful person here, but he's still cursed to wander and is unable to find rest.
Before we go there, why don't you exit out a screen share real quick?
Yeah.
And then, because I want to kind of talk a little bit about, I came across this chapter, and this is chapter 4 in the book. It's called Persecutions Led by Modern Preachers. And so these are, so they give an example, but there's actually a story in here in which the person, Joseph Smith, is tarred and feathered. And the story goes, this takes place in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they knock on this person's door, and he shows them a bucket and explains to them that this is the bucket that was used that contained the tar to tar and feather the prophet Joseph Smith. And this guy, when he sees him, says, GD, it says in here, GD the Mormons, GD the Mormons. He's cursing at him. He said, I got something to show you. I'm going to show you this thing, the tar and feather. And it's been passed along throughout the family, this bucket, that was used.
A proud artifact.
A proud artifact. But what's so fascinating, but what makes this story so crazy is that he talks about his father, or the grandfather, was one of the leaders of the mob, and was finally confined to his bed, where slow death came upon him, mortification setting at his toes. He died by inches, and mortification worked its way upward. Before dying, he called his family together and talked with them regarding the mobbing and their future course in life, stating that his days were numbered, but he wanted to tell them, so far as he was concerned, they could please themselves with which religious denomination they affiliated themselves with. But for his part, he was convinced that Joe Smith was all that he ever claimed to be, a prophet of God. But yet the guy's still cursing Joseph Smith. So it's just like a crazy story, and it's a signed affidavit. So I just thought that was interesting, because I was drawn to that particular chapter, because it's like, oh, it's my people, who persecuted you. And I came across that story, and of course the story doesn't quite add up, right? Because if the dad's imploring them, be tolerant of other religions and don't. And Joe Smith was a prophet, I don't see why his son or grandson is the one that would be cursing the Mormons as well. So it's just, there's so much going on in these stories. They're trying to teach you 3 or 4 different lessons and stuff like that. And sometimes they contradict each other, which I thought is kind of interesting as well.
Yeah. I saw that contradiction in the Jack Reed story as well, because he was a boastful person. Yet at the end of his story, he's saying that he's seen 13 other men die this kind of horrible death, and he had thought that he had escaped it by surviving past those 13 men. So I'm kind of wondering, if that's the case, if this is something he was seeing all along, it surprises me that he would be boastful. Right. Unless he was really confident that it was only going to be 13 for whatever reason, and he was home cleared, then maybe. But I still would think that having seen 13 people die in excruciting, awful, gruesome, horrifying death,
probably shouldn't be going around bragging.
Maybe tamp down the enthusiasm a little bit. So similar thing.
Yeah. He got God was God. He ticked off God when he started bragging. So that's obviously the moral of the story a
Well,
little bit there too.
I feel like the bragging was well received up into the point where they started dying inch by inch,
Right.
because
Yeah.
the reality is that a lot of people, it was seen as something that was positive because of the Mormon problem. I don't think a lot of people realize. And so when you would brag to someone, it would be well received. Oh, good. You took
Good for
care of
you.
that. It's only until they wandered to Utah where the bragging didn't quite go over the way it had back east,
Right.
right? So,
You know
Right.
what? I would be so curious just thinking about it. You wonder if we have similar stories in the RLDS tradition,
oh,
in their tellings, if
that's
maybe they have
interesting.
some folklore. That because of course this is Joseph Smith III, the son of the prophet. You got Emma Smith. I imagine that there are stories about people because they would have been living in that area, that general vicinity, because they even lived in Nauvoo for a long
Right.
time. It would be curious to see what kind of stories are in the RLDS folklore thing. I'll bet they have similar stories as well. So we'll have to look into that.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And Rebecca, you know about some other places similar folklore has been. I don't know. Do you want to go into that now?
Yeah, I was kind of researching, where did this whole idea, this narrative of rotting flesh and
Mm.
these biblical epic punishments came from. And at first, Maven and I were talking about, oh, is it sort of an occult kind of a thing, because that was so prevalent in the origins of early Mormonism. And actually, my co-host Landon started looking into it too. He's a really good researcher, and we came across some situations where Puritans and Quakers, the Puritans, atrocities were committed on the Quakers back in the 1600s. And it was sort of this idea. The Quakers, of course, didn't fight back. They were very peaceful, they were very religious, but this folklore started to evolve these same kinds of things. They would get theirs, the retribution from that was divine, and a lot of it had to do with, bodily ailments and putrefaction of the flesh. I believe I
Yes.
came across that word several times, whatever that
Yes.
means, I'm not sure. But so I think that existed in America in the folklore. And I think it was just it made perfect sense to hear that, of course, because you hear it about the Mormons, but your grandparents had heard it maybe about another group that was persecuted. So it just has to do with people that are disenfranchised, they can't protect themselves, things happen to them, and the only thing they can think is that this retribution will happen on a divine scale or maybe later in the next life. And so that's the only way you can comfort yourself. Righteous anger, right? Because
Right.
you have no power to
Yep.
do anything
Yeah.
about it.
It took me a long time to find those kinds of examples as
Yeah.
well. I really felt that there had to be.
Yeah,
I
they're
didn't think that
hidden.
this was going to be unique uh, to Mormon culture, early Mormon saints, and so it did surprise me how long
Yeah.
it took me to find some other ones, but they were there,
Yep.
So I suspected as much, and it made me happy that we were able to find some. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share slides again, and we're going to go into some of the symbolism. Some of it we've talked about already. So here we go. And ta-da. Okay, is it up?
Oh, yeah.
We're good?
There
Okay.
it is.
All right.
Uh,
So I'm going into scripture here now, because this idea of divine retribution and putrefaction of the flesh, I think, as you said, appears in scriptures. And so again, so I think even for the other stories from the Quakers or the Puritans, or there was like a Catholic story as well, they have their basis in scripture and in this time and that part of the world. So this is about Herod Agrippa the First. This is Acts 12, 21 through 23. And upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout, saying, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. So another one is Deuteronomy 28. "The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, and with the scab, and with the itch whereof thou canst not be healed, so that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. The Lord shall smite thee in the knees and in the legs with a sore botch that cannot be healed from the sole of thy foot unto the top of thy head." And the eyesight one, I put in because there's quite a few of the stories that specifically say that eyeballs like either rotted out or like fell out of somebody's head. So so this is kind of old stuff. Yeah. This is from Herodotus, Pheretima, mother of Cyrene. Again, I should look into these names before I say them. But she died a horrible death, her body seething with worms while still alive. And and that's such a common theme. Is just, yeah, just this. The maggots are already there. They're not dead. They're still alive, but already these things are happening. So this is more from the book, just some more quick short ones. This is a Mr. Howe, grandfather of Seth Howe. He related that following the assassination of Joseph Smith, his grandfather never saw a well day, although he lived for several years afterwards. His condition grew progressively worse, and physicians of the day who called to attend him were unable to diagnose it as any known affliction. Again, giving rise to, this is obviously divine, since it's unknowable, it's supernatural. Continuing on, but his suffering was so intense that he frequently expressed the desire to obtain poison to end it all. His family very carefully kept anything of that nature out of his reach, and at his final demise, he actually had rotted alive, finally dying in intense agony. There's another one. This is a man named Townsend, living in Iowa near Fort Madison, was one of the mob who assaulted and forced in the jail door. The pistol discharged by Joseph Smith wounded him in the arm near the shoulder, and it continued to rot without healing until it was taken off. And even then, it would not heal. He died 2 or 3 months afterwards, having literally rotted alive. Actually, I thought, Steve, do you want to read this one? I'm doing all the reading. I feel like I could give my voice a break.
Oh, okay, yeah, let's do that.
I know, if you're able to see it, I can keep going.
Okay, so Colonel of the Missouri mob. He was eaten with worms, a large black-headed kind of maggot, which passed through him by myriads, seemingly a half pint at a time. Before he died, these maggots were crawling out of his mouth and nose. He literally rotted alive. Even the flesh of his legs burst open and fell from the bones. They gathered up the rotten mass in a blanket and buried him without awaiting a coffin.
Oh, it's very vivid the way you read it, Steve.
Yes,
I know. It's very vivid.
I made a mistake in reading so many of these myself. I apologize to the audience.
Well, and the way that Steve read it kind of makes me realize, so the opposite of putrefaction is sort of purification, right? And that's basically what the religious, they are trying to purify them. It makes sense why it's all about the body and rotting from the inside, because the righteous people are doing the opposite. They're purifying themselves and they have a holy, demeanor, a holy body, a holy spirit. Yet these people rotting from the inside, the absolute opposite of a holy or spiritual person.
And the thing that you have to think about too is, like, when you're reading the biblical passages and even reading these passages, the reality is that modern medicine did not exist. So people actually did see a lot of, it's kind of like Lot's wife. Okay, we see this pillar of salt that's, or some kind of something looks like a statue, and a story develops that evolves into that becoming Lot's wife. So the similar thing would be is that, they're obsessed with, sores and scrapes. You had to be perfectly, like, no skin conditions at all to go into the temple. And this is, so basically this was existed. And so now you have somebody that's suffering. They look terrible. There must be a reason why they've been cursed, and that's why the lepers were treated the way that they were. They're obviously cursed from God. So you can tell where the person is in this state, and now I have to come up with a narrative to explain why they got into that state. And obviously they must have done something wrong, or they must have done something really terribly wrong to merit such a thing. And of course, you saw this a lot because you didn't have, hospitals, you didn't have modern medicine. And so that would be kind of like it would be another way of creating folklore to teach a lesson. Again, this is what this is all about, is making sense of the world and trying to tell a story. Yeah.
Well, look at Job, right?
Yeah.
Cursed with all kinds of bodily
and that predates
that predates all of it.
I mean, that's the oldest book in the Bible. So this is a story. This was not even written by the Jews. This is something that they adopted later on into their canon. That story was evolved into something that, but again, and it's really interesting because within the Jewish commentaries, they've actually sometimes refer to Job as Job the blasphemer, because in their telling, Job was actually around when I think it was during the plagues of Egypt, and he didn't help the Jews, and that was part of the reason why he was cursed. That's kind of I think that's like an addition that they added to the Jewish lore. And those of you who are ultra-Orthodox, I know I have a lot of ultra-Orthodox people that watch my program, correct me if I'm wrong, but because they even add to the story of Job outside of scriptures as well. So it's just kind of like, because they had to let's come up with another explanation as to why these things happened to Job as well. So just kind of interesting how we want to tell these stories and give. Again, it's trying to make sense of why bad things happen to people. Obviously, why bad things happen to good people. Obviously, they weren't good. So that's why something bad happened to them, right? That's kind of how their world would have operated and how they would have thought about things.
Yeah. And I like what you said, Rebecca. That was a new thought to me, that the putrefaction versus purification.
Yeah.
What that was really great. I already considered I guess the idea of, especially with skin diseases, skin is the most visible thing. So it's not quite, especially with all these exclamation points, and as animatedly as Steve
And the
read
way
the
Steve
story.
read it.
Yeah, it's not quite so easy to be so animated about like a hidden, type of stomach cancer that nobody sees, you know what I mean? So on the skin, it's very visible. So I had made that connection that what the skin is representing an inner kind of rot or putrefaction, that this kind of sin coming out and being seen for everybody else. But yeah, the opposite, the versus purification of the saints, I hadn't connected that. So thanks for that.
A lot to think about.
Yeah. I think I have a few more. This is another Mr. Blank. So again, someone else hard to look up. All right, his face and actually, I want Steve to do it.
Yeah,
again.
no, Steve is,
These
boy,
are
the
great.
ratings on this program, Steve, the
Yes.
way you're reading this, my goodness.
Well, okay. Let me play around here.
There
Okay,
you
so
go.
let's. Okay, so Mr. Blank, his face and jaw on one side literally rotted, and half his face actually fell off. One eye rotted out, and half of his nose, mouth, and jaw fell from his bones. The rot and the maggots continued to eat until they ate through the large or jugular vein of his neck, and he bled to death. He, as well as Townsend, stank so previous to their death that they had to be placed in rooms by themselves, and it was almost impossible to endure their presence, and the flies could not be kept from blowing them while alive. Wow, that's quite a story.
Whoa.
Mr. Blank, I feel so bad for you.
Yeah, I feel bad that I'm smiling or laughing, but just the way that
Yeah.
you're reading it, I can't. This is horrific. I'm sorry.
This one is going back to one of the three stories that I had read. This is Old Man Brooks. I'll go ahead and read this one. It's short. This is just going over, all of the old man's clothes had burned off of him, and he was burned all over his body from his feet to the top of his head. So this was only one of the few where a person was burned, but the idea of houses burning down was also a very common theme in this. And I think, I thought of two things. One was, I guess, more of an earthly kind of a thing, which is where, during a lot of these skirmishes, I guess we'll call them, between Mormons and the states of Missouri and Illinois, house burning and, village and town burnings were very common, and they went both ways. So it wasn't just one side on the receiving end of these kinds of atrocities. So I almost kind of wondered if there's some, karma, I guess, to misuse that word, in this house burning down around this man, but also back east, supposedly a lot of homes that had once belonged to, or had been in Nauvoo, ended up burning down, that were owned by non-Mormons, the ones that had driven the Mormons out. But I also kind of wondered, if there isn't a bit of hell imagery here, kind of more subtle, because this man's house burns down all around him, and he's burned all over and in a lot of pain, but he doesn't die. He has to suffer through all of it. So that was what maybe connected me to. And again, Mormons don't typically have maybe as much what's the word, I feel like maybe enthusiasm for hell is something I would maybe assign to certain evangelical groups versus Mormonism. Yeah. So I think that might be why it's also kind of maybe subtle. It's not specifically outright saying like this is going to be his fate, like burning in hell forever, but it's something very close. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Because then, of course, in hell, you're going to be on fire forever and you'll never die. So, that's a good point.
It seems like a pre-treatment almost.
Yeah.
Okay. And so here I go into the word of wisdom. These are just some real quick, with Old Man Brooks. He was a habitual user of chewing tobacco. Mr. McGuire. These are parts that I hadn't read. So the Mr. McGuire of the Jack Reed story, she describes him with a pipe with long stem held in his drooling mouth. And then a different man, Logan, also from the same story, as described as his tobacco drooling from his mouth, and his otherwise stinking person was disgusting. This is how Martha describes this man. Yes,
these are great. Like, I want to memorize these insults in case I ever need to use them.
Right. Yeah. And then of course with the unnamed grandpa, he asked about coffee and that he wanted some and some tobacco. So I think we can, and we've mentioned those. I'm just looking at my patterns here. I think we've actually covered a lot of that. Okay. So I do want to look now, I guess, if there's any more symbolism or thoughts you had before we kind of start breaking this down. And this is where we kind of will start to look at the things. Uh, I think that could be or maybe should have been the sign to teenage me that
Hmm.
Yeah.
maybe take some of these stories with a grain of salt, and what to look for in the future when you hear stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, to kind of pinpoint that. So, was there anything else about symbolism or anything like that before we move on to this part from you guys?
No, I think. What do you think? I
Yeah,
think.
no, I'm excited for this part.
Yeah.
And I like how you describe you found this book, you read it yourself. So I'm older than you. I had teachers and leaders tell me these stories. So it's very difficult to take a critical look when you have a trusted adult at church who maybe not as dramatically as Steve, but they still are telling, this was not folklore when I was growing up. These were real stories. This really did happen. These were the circumstances of these people. And so that's a whole different level because you don't ever look at it critically. So it's interesting for me to go back and think, like you said, how did I not deconstruct that when I was
Right.
16 in a Sunday school class hearing these? It was really the most exciting part of the lesson
Sure.
when you
Sure.
start hearing these
Right.
horrible
Why
things,
ruin a
right?
good
So these
story
Yeah.
are
by thinking about
juicy
it too much?
stories. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
exactly right. And so you internalize it. So yeah, taking your critical look is really important.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. And of
So
course, we would, a lot of us growing up, my parents and grandparents, and even me, we would have missionaries come and talk to the churches, and they would tell stories,
mhm.
often saying how these horrible things are happening to these people because they worship the wrong gods and idols, and so they would tell us gruesome details
Yeah.
because, of course, they didn't have modern medicine, so things would be much more shocking
Yeah.
to a Western audience. And I have to point out too, one of the reasons why somebody would obviously think this book might be historical is because it was published by Bookcraft. So obviously
Yeah.
this has an imprint, it's kind of has a seal of approval
Yeah.
that this is real history. And it comes across, of course, because you have the affidavits, which is really
Yeah.
interesting. So
Right. It does. So it does have that appearance, and I think that was also something that I found convincing as a
yeah,
teenager. It was like, oh,
Yeah.
these people signed it and said it was true, and someone
absolutely.
else said, yeah, I agree that what that guy
That's
said
right.
was true.
That's right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and I did want to say these kinds of things are still being passed on. And I don't know, I don't think so much in more official places, but it's just so easy for a seminary teacher to
Mhm.
kind of go off script to do this. And actually, so this was just a couple weeks after Steve and I agreed to talk about this book. A caller at the end of Mormonism Live had brought up that she had gone on a trip to one of the Mormon church history sites. I think it was Palmyra, but it might have been a different one. And the missionary couple, an older couple there, told some of these really gruesome stories. And so she brought up, again, this has just been a private conversation with me and Steve about this book, but she had brought up these gruesome deaths, and she had asked, she's like, I'm pretty sure they're not true, but at the same time, it really had an impact. And I'm just wondering, has anybody done any research on that? Did this happen? And I've never been so excited to know what seemed like some obscure information. And I feel bad. Her name was Crystal. I still remember her name. Was Crystal, and I was like, be on the lookout. In the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be on Steve's show. And again, that was like 4 months ago now. So apologies to Crystal and anyone else who watched that show who's been, wondering about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's still being taught, and it's still affecting people, even
Mhm.
someone who's kind of moved past it. And, I think the common sense is coming through. I'm pretty sure it's not true, but these are gruesome stories. So they do have an impact,
Oh,
and
sure.
they're designed to have an impact. So
Well,
yeah.
and I was going to say that as far as church authoritative sources, they do say that that's a fabrication. You can find it on Fair Mormon. You can find it. I forgot. I think one of the apostles even said Dallin Oaks. I was
actually
going to say it
co-authored,
was
yes.
Oaks. Yeah. Who said,
Yeah.
nope, they went on to live productive, happy, successful, pillar of the community type lives. But that's not really put in them. That's very
Right.
obscure. It's
It's
very
not
hard
in the
to
manuals. I
find.
don't even remember
Yeah.
the name of the book. I don't think
No.
anyone's ever brought it up.
No,
or,
no. So they're saying it, and
Yeah.
it's our fault that we can't find that information, I guess. But
Right.
it's very interesting.
Right.
Good point.
So I think so. I think the first clue, if you're hearing a story, sorry, I keep doing this. And so this is from an article, Folklore and History. I've got the reference down at the bottom if you want to check it out. But William A. Wilson says this: what we must remember is that what actually happened is often less important than what we think happened. We, virtually all of us, since we all belong to many folk groups, are motivated not by actual fact, by what we believe to be fact. And I found that I just found that very interesting. And this next quote, this is also a great article to read, and this was specifically about these kinds of diseases that end up on prominent figures. So medical data about prominent people cannot be accepted at face value. Medical history can be partisan, particularly when religious or political bias is present. So yeah, so I think that the first clue is when you hear a story, do you want to believe it? Is it supporting your narrative? Is it
Right.
supporting your group? And that's kind of the hardest one to see past, because I think it can come through so quickly that you don't even realize that your bias just opened the doors wide and just let that one in. But if you're looking, and if you're caring about this, I would say this would be a place to go. And just to give one example, and so this is still as a believer, I think I was starting to get to be more nuanced. But there's a tradition that initially the state of Utah was supposed to be named Deseret, and that's what the territory had been called. It's a very Mormon name. It's from the Book of Mormon, although I have heard that it might be Masonic. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, that is the name that the Mormons wanted, and that's not what they got. What they got was Utah, and that was based off of the many different Ute tribes in the area. So it was based off of the Native Americans that were here. So there's a tradition or a story that gets told that Ute means high in the mountains. And I'm forgetting the scripture off the top of my head, but it's the one that says that the Lord will establish his people in the mountains. And so it's kind of told as like, we didn't get the name we wanted, but the name that the government chose for us actually still, fits our story, and kind of seems prophetic in that way, and especially coming from someone or from a group that was considered and seen as antagonistic, and and it's always really nice when God lets your antagonizers basically further your cause for you.
Mhm.
But I remember believing that the first time I heard it as a teenager, but the second and further times I heard it, by then I was starting to clue in. And so for those that might not know, my degree is in anthropology, cultural anthropology, and folklore. This is why this is a fascinating topic for me. But one of the things you learn is that, especially when it comes to places like the United States, where we are a colonizing nation, we came in, there's a lot of slaughter, a lot of really unfortunate horrible things done to those who already lived here. And so whenever I learned, and again, this can be another clue, and this still happens a lot, and kind of the forewords from grandma kind of thing. And I see it happen in churches a lot, not just Mormonism, but also in evangelical and other mainstream Christian groups, is the taking of a narrative of Native Americans or a tribe in Africa, or people in South America. Whenever white people are using an indigenous group of people's story to bolster their own kind of colonization narrative, that's a huge red flag. And so I tried looking into that. I even talked to Thomas Murphy. He's also an anthropologist. He's a real one, I guess I should say. I only got my bachelor's. He's got the doctorate, so he's a real anthropologist. And his main area of study is Native Americans. So the truth of the matter is the word Ute is not something that is known or really can be traced, which also makes it very convenient for a story like this. So anyway, that was kind of a long aside, but it's just this kind of stuff that still happens,
Yeah.
So that was kind of what clued it into me, was just like, that's really convenient for us, at the expense of somebody else, especially considering, for those that may not know, the atrocities that Mormons specifically committed against the peoples here. So anyway, that was just one of the things I wanted to go over.
Well, I think that if it doesn't fit your narrative, you have to make it fit, even if that means inventing something. And I don't think that you necessarily even know that you're doing it.
Right.
So, which I have a story I have a family member who had a child that had seizures. Somewhere in an airport, they met a general authority who gave him a blessing. The seizures stopped. This story was written up in a church magazine, the Ensign, as it used to be called. So years later, now this child would be, in his 20s. another member of the family was in a Relief Society meeting somewhere out of state. And the woman was telling this story from the ensign as an inspiring story in the class. She read the story and then she added this. And that young man today is a stake president in Utah. Well, that wasn't true. He was actually in jail. But
Oh,
this woman, for some reason, felt the pull and the drive to just make the story that much more special. That this little boy was saved by a general authority and he was now a state president. So the other family member went up to her afterwards and said, "That's my nephew. He's not really a state president. He's actually, incarcerated." So I always thought that was a very interesting study in human nature, that for some reason she had to add that. Just to make
Let me
it
ask
that
you,
much more special.
how do we know that you didn't just come up with folklore?
It's true. It does sound very
Good point.
implausible.
Yeah.
Although if you know me, I have the strangest stories that I know.
This is true.
You're right. Think about it critically, Steve. It's very possible. Don't believe anything on face value.
that's right. Whatever you can look up, that's always a good thing.
Exactly. It's all anecdotal.
Why do I have a feeling that perhaps post and ex-Mormons might also have their own folklore too?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, we have confirmation bias bubbles that we love to
Right.
feed. And if it doesn't fit in and it bumps against the bubble, we go, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's
No,
easy to reject it.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
reject
Oh,
it.
yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
absolutely.
Well, and it's funny too, because, when I first came on the scene and I would interact like people in the ex-Mormon like Reddit and stuff like that, I would get attacked because
Yeah.
of course evangelical. And they just had this, and it was so crazy to me because it's like you spent a lifetime feeling that you've suffered, a lot of things, and you were told things that weren't true or whatever it is, and you felt like you were wronged. And then you have somebody who maybe you don't know anything about them. Perhaps the person was these ex-Mormons angry because they were gay or any number of
Yeah.
things that happened to them. They were misunderstood. And then this evangelical comes in and I just get all this anger, all this, I get it. But I'm thinking, first of all, why are you mad at me still? Because you're mad at me because you're a Mormon, but you're mad at me now because I believe in God. And so it's like you come to this with like a preconceived idea. Now I don't get that kind of pushback now because I think people kind of get where I'm coming from. But I understand how people just, we're talking in group, out group. You can see the same thing developing in the ex-Mormon community as well. So I think, and when I say that, because we all have a tendency to do that, and so we have to recognize.
Do you remember when you were attacked in the Good Book Club?
Oh
Do
yeah.
you remember that? He's a member of our post-Mormon book club. And there was a time, there were some members we didn't really know very well.
Mhm.
And Steve was sharing some things. And
Yeah.
he was, we had to kind of intervene
Yeah.
and try to cut the person off because Steve was kind of rocking his confirmation
Yeah.
bias bubble. It
Yeah.
was very uncomfortable for everyone.
It
So,
was, yeah. And it was
yeah.
funny because because of that, I don't know if you noticed or not, but for like the next 2 or 3 sessions of the Good Book Club,
You
I didn't say anything.
You
Because
did.
I was actually worried, like, oh, maybe I crossed the line.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm here to listen,
Right.
and I'm not, because sometimes like you're going into a post Mormon group and it almost sounds like, the Joseph Smith man, he was like kind of cool. We probably would have been friends, that kind of thing. So I better sit back a little bit.
Yeah,
Here.
no,
Just listen.
I remember
Yeah.
there were moments like that, like on your interview where I'm like, hard disagree there, but I kept listening, so we're gonna have to agree to disagree there on that one. But yeah, no, I totally get it, and it might be fun to see too, because this is a blind spot for me, and so even now. Other than I can get maybe the stereotype because I've had so many evangelical experiences that were really, really bad. So when somebody comes in and that's all I know about them, they get all of that association. I have no need or reason I see to give them a chance to just do the same thing.
It's understandable too.
Right.
Yeah.
But so that's I think that's obviously a bias and a stereotype, but I am curious, what are ex-Mormon narratives or ex-Mormon folklore? So if people want to put down in the comments what they've seen,
Wow.
I'm curious. I would love to see that.
That could be a whole nother show.
Absolutely.
Seriously, because I know they
Maybe,
exist and
yeah.
they're evolving more and more as
Yeah,
more people
yeah.
get
Right.
involved.
And I
so.
think probably when something's come up, I'll be like, okay, oh yeah, but just as of right now, like I'm not able to think of them. So this will be perfect.
Well, and it's important. We're all wired in a certain way, and and sometimes people will replace one thing with another, but they'll still functionally be the same kind of person. They're just now they have different set of beliefs, but they're going to still act upon them in a very similar way. And I just actually kind of wanted to wrap a bow a little bit on this too, because one of the things we talked about also too is that folklore and conspiracy theory, which is kind of like a type of conspiracy theory, telling a story, a narrative. You know, conspiracy
Very
theories,
clear heroes and villains.
Yes.
yeah, heroes and villains.
Yes.
And we've even talked like you can have fun, like make up a fun conspiracy theory, and they can
Yeah.
be benign at times too. But now we live in a world too, but there's a consequence because our society literally is going mad in one sense, right? We got this QAnon stuff that's out there and all this conspiratorial stuff, and people read something online and they try to tie it in with another thing, and it's become a really a kind of a dangerous thing too. So we also have to be aware that's sometimes folklore and fables are meant to teach us certain values, and they can be quite useful because we are storytellers. We told stories on the campfire, and they were to tell lessons, to impart wisdom to future generations. But we also have a parallel where we can also see it veer off in a very ugly way as well. So we have to be aware of that too. And we can see where it can go so far in one direction. Maybe speak to that a little bit too, both of you.
Yeah, no, I agree because there's definitely benefits to cohesion, to feeling like you're a part of the group, that kind of building of sentiment towards people who are like yourself. Serves a lot, I think, and evolutionarily speaking, to help the group to work together and work through things. Whereas, sometimes having a common enemy, sometimes that's the best way to get people to come together. And to kind of go back to your point, Steve, I sometimes think when it comes to ex-Mormons and Mormon spaces, it's almost like a sibling relationship, one that's kind of cantankerous, where one they're always picking on each other. But when an evangelical steps into the conversation, is like, Mormons aren't Christian, then it's like, yeah, it's just instant. I that's one thing where I'm just like, dang, I really do not want to be put in a place to defend Mormonism, but that's going to do it every single time, and it's just kind of like that. Like, what did you say about my little brother? Like, excuse you, I'm there.
Like, I'm the one that can say that. You can't say that to my
exactly.
little brother.
It's like, I have something to say to you about, So it works though. Like, it's so funny how instant that I can be in the middle of arguing with somebody, and then when someone's like, you're not Christian, then it's just like that argument's over. Now we're on you. So in a way, like, it can be good, but like you said, Steve, it can go too far to the point that other people are dehumanized, or they can't be believed or even seen as worth, or having even opinions. I feel like I don't know if my father is as far down QAnon, but he's definitely very conservative, and he's been very conspiratorial as well, like with the election and things like that. And I think one of the hardest things that's been about seeing that is not just my belief that my father is very incorrect about the way he's viewing things. Obviously, he sees that about me as well. But I feel like my father can't even believe that the thoughts that I have any legitimacy, that they're really mine, that I just haven't just fallen for leftist, progressive, Democrat, just libel. And I don't know. I sometimes, it's really affected my relationship with my father in multiple ways. So I haven't talked to him in a while, but the last time I did, I really felt like just an empty shell of a person. I felt like I didn't matter to him. And that was really, really, really difficult to see. And not just me, but just like my thoughts, like it just, none of it mattered to him. He couldn't see me as his daughter having an opinion that could potentially be legitimate in any way. Right. And so that was an extremely rough moment for me, and I haven't talked to him since then. So there is that dark side to it.
And I want you to chime in too, but we actually talked about this before, is that this is kind of like an important book to your dad too.
Yeah.
And maybe speak, because you even asked him to try to find the copy that you originally had growing up. You just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And honestly, I actually for not this past Christmas, but the Christmas before, I gave him basically the same edition as the one you're holding for Christmas. So this was also like at the same time, I bought both of these books at the same time. This one was mine, the older one. My dad likes older books. I did give him the option to choose between the two, but he went with the older one. So yeah, so it wasn't the older edition that he had, and I am still sorry that is gone. I do hope he finds it sometime. And wish it would be nice to kind of have this discussion with him, but there's
Mhm.
no way that we would have
Mhm.
remotely any kind of a discussion like a productive one like we've had here. So yeah, so like that was kind of like maybe a weird kind of connection with my dad a
Yeah.
little bit. That's kind of fallen apart at this point. So yeah, I think if I was still talking to him, even though I couldn't have this kind of conversation with him, I maybe could have at least said, "Hey, I talked about this book on this
Yeah.
podcast. You can see it,"
That's
But
right.
that's not gonna happen
Well,
either. So
and let me just talk to the audience here. Now, I know a lot of you are conservative or just true blue Mormons. I don't even have to say conservative, just people who believe, and maybe you have family members that have left, and you have daughters and sisters and friends and cousins like Maven. And part of the reason why I started this channel was because I wanted to do bridge building between the evangelical community and the LDS community. But I also want to try to accomplish the important thing is like I tell people, you need to hear all the voices, all the stories. And I just want you to realize that, Maven has a very good heart. She's a very nice person. I really appreciate her. And in many ways, she's a product of the restoration. She's a product of Mormonism. It helped shape her for who she is. And in many ways, she's probably grateful for that. Right. But, we all go down different paths in our journey. So I just want to encourage all those of you who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have family members that maybe you haven't talked to for a while. Maybe you just kind of put up a barrier, or maybe you feel they did to you. Let me just encourage you. Why don't you reach out to them, talk to them, and just remember that they are a fellow image bearer, whatever you think of who they are. So that's something I just want to share with my audience. But Rebecca, you have anything you want to say?
No, I was going to say that. So I started a book club called the Good Book Club
Hmm.
for post or nuanced Mormons about 2.5 years ago. And the first book everybody wanted to read, because we based it all on what our members want to read, was Sapiens.
Mm.
So this book first introduced the idea to me that Homo sapiens, human beings, we are who we are and where we are today because of the cognitive spark
Mm-hmm.
that allowed us to create mythology and tell stories
Mm-hmm.
and bond ourselves together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I sort of had thought that around a little in my brain, but it really made it so clear. This is why, even though they compared, of course, to the Neanderthals, which were bigger, stronger, more fit, why did we come out on top? Because of our ability to rally around a myth, to create a mythology. So for a while, a lot of us were wearing bracelets that said, live your fiction, live your myth,
Mm-hmm.
because we realized that we were all creating.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you take your myth and you find others that value your myth and espouse your myth, then you're a group, and then
Mm-hmm.
you can accomplish quite a bit. The dark side of that, as you touched on and
Mm-hmm.
Maven touched on, is then when you encounter other people
Yeah.
that don't share your myth, or are at complete odds with your myth,
Mm-hmm.
then you are hardwired on a DNA level to
Mm-hmm.
not accept and to be suspicious, almost a self preservation. You
Mm-hmm.
can't hear it. You cannot take that in or internalize that at all, because it's dangerous to you and your group survival. So, understanding that, it made you realize why you sometimes need to listen to difficult things,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you value relationships. You
That's
need to
right.
look outside of your own group and yourself, and you need to try to connect and interact. So, I mean, there are all kinds of problematic things, and it's very
right.
difficult, but learning that from Sapiens and being able to discuss that with other members of the book club who are nuanced or post Mormons, encountering situations like Maven described on all different levels,
Yeah.
we actually took some comfort in that, and it kind of taught us that we need to do our part to reach out. We need to understand why people may not be able to understand what
Right.
we're saying, and understand why we can't understand them and they
Yep.
can't understand us, because really on a molecular level, we are human beings. We are where we are because of that. We're
Mm.
protecting our mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's my
I want to
PSA.
riff off of that. And I might again, this is something that people can correct me in the comments for. I want to say, I think that the Homo sapiens, I think it means like man, the producer, or man, the builder. And I don't remember who said it, and it might even actually be in the book Sapiens
Yeah.
somewhere. But I remember a quote that I, at some point in my schooling, that said, that perhaps we were misnamed, and it really, we should be called Homo neurons, man, the storyteller,
Mm.
rather than
Yeah.
man, the builder. That would have been a more proper name, or a
Mhm.
more fitting name for how we differentiate. But I do want to say, like, while we do have this, innate kind of tribal, or I desire to be part of a community, I think that is for survival purposes. I think there's an evolutionary bent to that. I do want to say I also very strongly believe that the curiosity to reach out and to learn and to adapt to new things is also part of us as well. So I do want to celebrate, because I mean, if it was just the one, there would be no hope at all for us, honestly. And it is getting darker. I think that it is a lot of things are getting more polarized. But I think that there's hope, and I think that hope is just as built into us. Or if you're not fully just only on the natural side of things, I think there's plenty for supernatural, for an argument for that. That this is maybe a divine spark, from God, that is part of us. So
Mhm.
I just want to say, I think there's something to celebrate for, first of all, people like Steve, who are bridge builders, and or all three of us, we've all been through significant changes in our beliefs, and just based on our life experiences and empathy for other people, and being willing to learn about that. And so there's things that I have fundamentally changed 180 degrees on, because of travel, or because of knowing somebody, finally meeting somebody that's part of this, demonized out group,
Mm.
that helped to humanize them for me. And I've been forever changed by that. So, and I feel like, in a way, that's one thing that makes it difficult for my dad, because he hasn't changed, or at least that's what I see. So, I feel like sometimes he treats me like I've always been this way, even though he's the one that raised me, or I get accused of having, my liberal education that ruined me, and I have to remind him my liberal education came from Brigham Young University. So, like, something to think about, but yeah, those a lot of us are not afraid, and are willing to go to the enemy, quote unquote, the enemy, and make them our friend. And so, anyway, I think that's to be celebrated and striven for. So,
It was so interesting. I was my Uber driver took me into town today, and he's a Muslim, and he's originally from Pakistan. And we were talking and conversing, and he was very interested in what I was doing. Of course, I was very interested in hearing his story too. And towards the end, I asked him if he had any siblings. And he told me he had a brother, but he was killed. He came to America in 2011, and he said it was right before I came to America. My brother was killed. And I said, "Did you see it happen? What happened?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "My father, him, and I were crossing the street, and there's this car um, going 60 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone, and killed his brother. It took him 10 minutes to get to his brother's body, because he had been hit like a half mile down the road. And his brother ended up being hospitalized. They did surgery, but he ended up dying. But what was so fascinating was because I was like, and he was in the Air Force. He was driving a private car, and of course, it's very corrupt government and all this kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, whatever happened to this guy? I'm thinking, well, maybe because it's this corrupt society that he was sent to jail and everything like that. But what happened was, actually they chose not to press charges because they decided that they were going to forgive him, and also they understood that he was the only son, and then to take away from their family the only son a chance to, for the how important, of course, a son would be in that culture, that they actually forgave him. That's also a good part of religion too. And in Christians, what do you say to that, huh? That's about as most Christ-like as it gets, and that comes from a Muslim. Think about that. He had no hatred or malice in his heart towards this man. So I think so. We can also, and I'm only telling you this because it happened today, but I also think it's because it's important that this can also show us that even religion can be where bad things happen, and there are times where you want to be angry or bitter, or all these kind of things that are part of us. That the faith and all this can also sustain us to give us the ability also to forgive, which is a very, very important thing, whether you believe there's a God or not. That because we also have to bring healing and our myths, if you want to call them that, that's fine. The stories that we tell, and the importance of learning lessons, but also be able to forgive people who've done bad things to you is also can also add to your healing as well. So that's another thing I just wanted to share with the audience today too, that really struck me, and I think it's a beautiful thing. So say what you will about atheists, what you want to say. Fine, I was there for a long time. Respect you. Maven, you're there too. Get it? Understood.
There.
But I just want to, but I also want to say that we can. That's a remarkable story, and then again, that's based on stories that they believe that are true, that they pass on to their families. that the values that their cultures have taught them as well. The ability to forgive and that was a valuable insight. I'm sorry, I'm blabbering, but I thought that was an important thing to share
No,
with the
that's
audience
okay.
today.
You meet the most interesting people when
I
you're
do.
out and about. And they
Yeah.
always were so willing to talk to you. That's what's
Mhm.
amazing. They just open up and tell these stories. It's awesome.
Most
You've
of
got a gift.
my interviews happen off camera, folks.
Yeah.
So
There it is.
always working on
There it
that.
is.
So, I mean, before we wrap this thing up, do either one of you have something you want to say to the audience?
Yeah,
Or something you
I
wanna
don't know.
add?
I'm kind of torn because I feel like that was a really great discussion, and I was thinking this is a good place to end. But then I also feel like we'd be leaving it kind of on a cliffhanger, not to talk about what actually happened to these men.
We have to wrap
So
it up. Yeah.
it's okay. I mean, I don't know. I feel bad like ruining the moment, but I also feel like the audience would want that. Do you guys agree, or do you think they would want the wrap
part
up?
of it because we've talked about mythology and stories, and
Yeah.
now let's hear, more of the factual things that actually occurred. It helps you understand how it was all put into context. So yes.
Yes, and then we can always come back to this. I think
Yeah.
I honestly think this was the best part of the interview. So if anybody wants to be like taking out shorts or TikToks, I hope
Oh,
I hope
okay.
it comes from that part. Yeah. Yeah. But for the curious, for those that need the end of the story, like myself, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And we are near the end, so this is
Okay.
just a few more things. So this is something that Rebecca, you talked about with the saints. The early saints had taken vengeance oaths to avenge the blood of the prophets. So that's one of the things that, if you know, kind of makes these stories of these really kind LDS people, especially in the 1800s when a lot of these stories are taking place, not in the 1940s, not in the 1950s when the stories are being gathered. This would absolutely, I mean, even for Lundwall, for the compiler, based on his date of birth, I believe he would have had this kind of writing. So this is actually about George Q. Cannon. This is from a diary entry of a different family member, but Cannon understood when he had his endowments in Nauvoo that he took an oath against the murderers of the prophet Joseph Smith as well as other prophets, and if he had ever met any of those who had taken a hand in that massacre, he would undoubtedly have attempted to avenge the blood of the martyrs. Now later,
Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Yes,
It's one
yeah.
of my soapbox items. The blood of any prophet. Yep.
And we do know, like, it was put into the ceremony. This is showing a slightly different wording. You and each of you do covenant and promise that you will pray and never cease to pray Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, and that you will teach the same to your children and your children's children unto the third and fourth generation. So this is definitely something to be passed on. But the key change here is that it's on Almighty God now, because the previous covenants were starting, causing problems, especially when it came to wanting statehood. So yeah, so this time, the wording's still there, but now it's kind of being put upon God. So I did briefly want to go over some of the outcomes, and this article here, a different take on the Carthage mob and the research it was based on, is I'll provide the sources to Steve so he can put them there if you'd like to check them out. But I'll go ahead and Steve, do you want to read this part?
Just the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Those who were responsible for the death of the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram on June 27th, 1844, did not rot away because of the Mormon curse, as N.B. Lundwall claimed in his book, The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet Joseph Smith, but went on to live normal lives. Another characterization from B.H. Roberts found in the introduction to Volume 6 of the History of the Church, which called the mob a criminal element and ruffians, isn't correct either.
All right. Rebecca, I didn't ask you to read. Do you want to go ahead and read this one?
I will, because I found just looking into what really happened to them to be one of the most fascinating parts. It was amazing. So the Carthage mob members lived normal lifespans. So they didn't die early. They lived a normal lifespan through which they prospered financially. They ran for and won political office and generally appeared to be protected and honored by their fellow citizens for their participation in the murders of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Hence the bragging. It was well received. They were actually honored for having done a service to humanity.
Right. And then this was just, I just compiled some really quick things okay, so this is called Respectable Assassins, a collective biography and socioeconomic study of the Carthage mob. This is by Deborah Jo Marsh. So this was her thesis for her master's. So the average mob member was above the median in age, wealth, education, the percent that were married. They had respected jobs or were in respected industries, and quite a few of them were landowners. So the idea of them being kind of young, rough cut, uneducated ruffians from the backwoods just really doesn't hold. And then the successes, and I put in light a failed prophecy, because there were prophecies, many prophecies, about these, about these things here. So they often had continued or exponentially increased wealth. There was it's escaping me now, but I think one of the figures that was shown by Deborah was like something like over 250% above what was average, like for everyone, for others in similar classes as them. They really did well. Again, successful political careers. Their involvement in the Mormon difficulties was seen as an achievement in their lives. They maintained respect and status, and maintained relationships with family, friends, and community. And those were some other themes that we didn't really dig into as much. But along with the rotting, those were the really gruesome things, and the wandering, and burnt houses, that kind of stuff. A very common theme, especially in these prophecies, are that these people, like Rebecca, you were saying, that their family wouldn't care. They lose all status, they lose all respect. Nobody, like, they're beggars in the streets a lot of times. So poverty is also another one. Like they just get nothing. Everything's taken. It almost is like Job. They don't have their health, they don't have their sanity, they don't have their family. They don't even have a home. And so so those are also extremely common themes in this book that we just didn't even really have time to get into, because there's a lot that could be gotten into with this. So so that's, I guess that's the wrap up there. Sometimes, in a way, I'm glad, because I guess it's a good sign for me, and maybe for where I'm at, that it's possible to live a normal and happy life, after having left the religion of your childhood.
Rotting, right?
Right. Yeah. Hopefully no rotting in it for me. But also, like I said, as the teenage me was driven to pity for these men that I thought had really had these fates. So I think obviously it's good that it didn't. But on the other hand, if that's the case, then you still kind of have this problem, as on the believing side, of this kind of unsettled injustice. There's no retribution. They, if they're able to be successful, while the saints were still driven out of their homes, it's definitely disappointing. So it makes sense that there would be this narrative around it.
Yep, makes perfect sense. Well, Rebecca, this is quite an interesting interview, wasn't it?
I love it. I think we need to do a part 2 and kind of
continue on.
move forward and talk about some of the mythology that's more current, which I find to be mythology of warning. The stories of running into the prophet in the elevator, and he's warning you. There are all kinds of stories like that. So I would love to reconvene at some point and take it even a little farther. Wouldn't there?
Mormonism Live has actually kind of taken some folklore that told by apostles and prophets, and kind of done the same thing, where when it's more modern, it's a little bit easier to kind of look into some of these things. So but folklore is alive and well today, as we know.
Absolutely. So first of all, Maven, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for being patient with me again. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Rebecca, for hosting a very special episode of Mormon Book Reviews, because normally you're MMR. So this was really cool.
Usually I'm over there.
The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet. There we go. There's the book. And so real quick, folks, I just want to remind you, please leave your comments. Tell us what you think about this episode, and maybe tell us some of your favorite folklore that you experienced growing up, whether you're evangelical or from any other religion, including Latter-day Saints. I also want to remind you that for those of you, and we're going to have links in the descriptions, everything that we talked about. The Maven's going to make sure I get those. And also in the links, if you would like to financially support the channel, we have links to our Patreon and PayPal, as well as our merch store, which, by the way, I think personally this hat would goes perfectly well
with the blue.
Yes, there we go.
There you go.
It goes perfect with the hair and the outfit. I love it.
And the nails. Don't forget
the nails.
The nails. I only know how to be one color now.
That is awesome.
I thought I just had to do it. I was like, that matches my hat.
Well, and that proves that she's here.
Yeah, that's
because
right.
you literally handed it right next door. So unless it was a trick, she's right there.
So check out the merch store at MormonBookReviews.com. And of course, we are on all the major podcast formats as well. And just really quick, folks, remember the most important thing. Just remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.